My dad praised my daughter at Christmas. Then my sister snapped, shattered her $18,000 violin, and screamed, "Why not my child?" Hello everyone, I am Ethan Caldwell, a 42-year-old software engineer based in Seattle. My wife Claire Caldwell and I have a daughter, Madison Maddie Caldwell. We live in the Ballard neighborhood, and the sound of Maddie's violin every afternoon has become a regular part of our day. Every time I see my daughter holding her violin with a beaming smile, I am overcome with pride. But at the same time, I'm sad because I still remember what happened at my parents' Christmas party 3 years ago. In December 2022, I accepted an invitation to my parents' holiday party in Seattle. Maddie was only 9 years old back then. Maddie carefully carried her violin case in her arms the entire way there, occasionally stroking it affectionately before exiting the car and walking into my parents' house. I turned to face my daughter and gently said, "If you're uncomfortable, please let me know. We can leave anytime." Maddie nodded and took my hand, saying, "I'll be fine, Dad." "I want to play the violin for Grandpa," my daughter whispered. I reached up and patted her on the head to encourage her. We had just exited the car when Dad opened the door and dashed out, his face beaming. He spread his arms wide, hugged Maddie tightly and told her, "There's my granddaughter. I missed you so much. You grew up so quickly. I almost didn't recognize you." Maddie laughed as my father lifted her. Then he turned to me, slapped my shoulder hard and said excitedly, "Ethan, you've finally arrived home. I thought you had forgotten your way home." After Dad's joke, I smiled and replied, "I'm relieved that you're still as strong as ever." After a few greetings, Dad placed his arm around my shoulder and led Maddie into the house. He kept asking about my work and Maddie's schooling. His enthusiasm made me feel good after a year apart. When we entered the house, the atmosphere changed completely. My mother was sitting on the sofa at the time, and she only glanced at us once before turning back to talk to my sister. She did not stand up or greet us. Instead, she nodded slightly, as if we were strangers. My sister Vanessa Harper was sitting next to my mother, along with her husband Derek Harper and their 10-year-old daughter Haley Harper. Haley sat huddled in the corner of the sofa, her gaze sadly directed downward at her hands. I noticed Haley had lost a lot of weight since we last saw her. Her eyes appeared tired, lacking the brightness of a child. When Maddie approached to say hello, Haley forced a weak smile and turned away. Just as I was still surprised by their attitude, my cousin Tyler Brooks emerged from the kitchen, holding a beer. Tyler was 30, the son of Uncle Daniel Brooks, my father's younger brother. Tyler noticed me and came over to pat my shoulder in a friendly manner, saying, "Ethan, long time no see. You look good." Uncle Daniel followed Tyler. He came over, wrapped his arm around me, and said warmly, "Ethan, I have missed you so much. Maddie is this big now. The last time I saw her, she was tiny." Following what he had said, I inquired about his health and the other relatives who were still present in my parents' living room. My relatives' enthusiasm and care for my family warmed my heart. At the time, I had no idea that jealous eyes were following our every move. Around 6:30 p.m., the Christmas party was held in a forced atmosphere. Vanessa constantly brags about her management position, major projects, and year-end bonuses. Mom sat listening with satisfaction, occasionally nodding in agreement. Derek occasionally spoke up to support his wife, but it was clear that he was also nervous due to the party's intense atmosphere. Uncle Daniel attempted to lighten the mood by sharing old family stories. He talked about when our entire family went camping at Mount Rainier when we were kids, as well as the football games we watched as a family. Tyler also tried to create a cheerful atmosphere by sharing enjoyable military experiences, but I could tell he was aware of the tension. In the middle of dinner, Mom turned to Haley and asked, in a somewhat harsh tone, "Haley, how's piano going lately? Your mother stated that you have been skipping lessons for weeks." Haley hung her head and did not respond to my mother's question. Vanessa jumped in with a tense voice. "She's sluggish about practicing. I signed her up for lessons at the best center in Seattle, but she won't even try." Uncle Daniel saw this and immediately attempted to defend Haley. He said loudly, "Haley is still young. Give it time and she'll become interested." Vanessa did not respond to Uncle Daniel. She remained silent, staring at her daughter with annoyance. While the situation was tense, my father made a grave mistake. He turned to Maddie and proudly announced to everyone, "Maddie is different. She's extremely hardworking. She practices the violin every day. Okay, Maddie?" After my father's unexpected question, Maddie nodded shyly, as if she was uncomfortable with the comparison. I noticed Haley lower her head, her shoulders trembling slightly. Vanessa tightened her grip on her wine glass at the party table, her face darkening as she realized my father's toxic comparison. I wanted to say something to calm things down, but Dad went on enthusiastically. Maddie even made it into the gifted class. My Maddie is the best. Mom looked at Dad, annoyed, but said nothing. Vanessa gritted her teeth, attempting to suppress something boiling inside. At this point, Uncle Daniel attempted to salvage the situation. He exclaimed loudly, "Both Haley and Maddie are wonderful. Each has their own talents." Following Uncle Daniel's words, the other relatives quickly changed the subject to avoid a potential family conflict. At the time, I had no idea that a storm was slowly forming and would tear my family apart in a matter of minutes. After dinner, as everyone was preparing to exchange gifts, my father clapped his hands and exclaimed, "Maddie, I heard you play really well." When Maddie heard Grandpa's request, she looked up at me with worried eyes. I nodded slightly to encourage her, and she timidly stepped forward, taking the violin from the case she had brought into the house. Maddie stood in the center of the living room, her little fingers trembling slightly as she rested the violin on her shoulder. A few seconds later, my daughter took a deep breath and began playing Silent Night, which she had practiced for weeks and arranged in her own style. My father sat up straight as the first sound rang out, his face beaming with pride. Haley had an undeniable admiration for Maddie at the time. Tyler nodded rhythmically and whispered, "Awesome." Uncle Daniel and Aunt Megan listened intently, their faces lit up as they heard the melodic tune. Derek nodded along with the rhythm, demonstrating genuine interest for the first time that evening. Only Vanessa and my mother sat with their faces as cold as ice. Vanessa's eyes narrowed every time Maddie finished a difficult passage, and Mom turned away as if she didn't want to see it. Then something happened that I could not have imagined, even in my wildest dreams. Vanessa stood up just as Maddie reached the climax. She took quick, decisive steps toward Maddie. Before anyone could react, Vanessa yanked my daughter's violin from her grasp. The music abruptly stopped. Maddie stumbled back, her eyes wide with horror. My daughter screamed in terror, "Aunt Vanessa, don't." But it was too late. Vanessa raised the violin high and slammed it hard to the ground. The sound of breaking ripped through the air. The violin costs $18,000. My daughter's gift, for which I had worked overtime and saved for 3 years, was now shattered. The strings snap and twist. The body broke open. The neck is almost completely separated. Haley jumped out of her chair, her face pale with horror. She screamed in a choked voice, "Don't do that, Mom. Don't." Tyler and Uncle Daniel both jumped up at the same time, their faces filled with horror. Tyler yelled at Vanessa, "Are you crazy?" Aunt Megan covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes widening in shock. Vanessa continued to scream even after everyone else had done so. She stepped on the broken pieces, grinding them under her heels, as if she wanted to completely erase the violin from existence. When I saw that scene, my heart seemed to stop for a few seconds. Then, an excruciating pain struck me. Not physical pain, but the pain of seeing my child's violin smashed. And Maddie, my daughter, stood there, her entire body shaking and tears streaming down her young face. She looked at the broken pieces of her violin, and then up at me, her eyes full of despair. My father jumped out of his chair in response to my sister's unexpected action. He yelled, "Are you crazy, Vanessa? What the hell are you doing?" Vanessa did not respond. She simply stood there, staring intently at my daughter as if she were looking at an enemy. She then let out a loud, cold laugh that chilled me to the bone. At this point, I lost control of myself. Rage flared up, extinguishing all reason. I lunged at Vanessa, fists clenched, only wanting to teach her a lesson. But before I could reach her, Derek, Tyler, and my father rushed in to help. Derek grabbed my arm. Tyler held my shoulder, while my father stood between Vanessa and me, blocking our path. I screamed angrily, "Let me go. She destroyed my daughter's violin. Let go." Tyler gripped me tightly and said sternly, "Ethan, calm down. Violence will not solve anything." I struggled violently, attempting to break free from their grip. After everything had happened, my mother sat calmly on the sofa, her face cold and emotionless. She simply said quietly and evenly, "Calm down. It's only a violin." That statement from my mother fueled my rage. I struggled to break free, but couldn't. They were holding me too tightly. Claire went unnoticed amidst all the chaos. My wife had stood up at some point, moving silently as a shadow. Claire suddenly grabbed Vanessa's arm and pulled hard. To everyone's surprise, my wife dragged my sister into the bedroom, just a few steps from the living room. The door slammed shut with a solid thud. Everyone stood stunned for a few seconds by my wife's unexpected action. Tyler and my father let me go before rushing to the door and pounding hard. My father yelled, "Claire, open the door! What are you doing in there?" Derek also ran over, repeatedly turning the doorknob, but it was ineffective. Vanessa's screams came from the inside. Desperate cries for help are mixed with the sounds of impact. "Help me!" Vanessa pleaded. "Help me!" Derek used his shoulder to ram the door, but it did not budge. He screamed, "Claire, open the door right away. I'll call the cops." Uncle Daniel stood beside him, helpless, and Aunt Megan hugged Haley, who was sobbing uncontrollably. My mother stood up and walked near the door, but she did not appear panicked at all. She stood there with a cold face, observing everything. I stood in the middle of the living room, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to break down the door and stop Claire, but another part, the dark part that no one dared to admit, felt strangely satisfied. 7 minutes felt like a century. Then the door opened. Vanessa walked out with a bruised face, swollen lips and disheveled hair. She was staggering and had to lean against the wall to stay upright. A streak of dried blood clung to the corner of her mouth. Uncle Daniel and Aunt Megan gasped in horror when they saw Vanessa's condition. Dad noticed Vanessa's face. He stepped back, horrified, and said, "My God, Claire, did you beat Vanessa like this?" When my mother saw her beloved daughter being beaten, she approached Vanessa and helped her sit down on a chair. She turned to Claire with cold eyes and screamed, "How dare you hit my daughter? How dare you hit your husband's sister?" Claire now stood in the doorway, her expression strangely calm. My wife shrugged and said coldly, "She fell on her own. If you don't believe it, just ask her." Vanessa screamed with trembling voice, "She's insane. I'll call the cops. I will put her in jail." Dad then stepped into the center of the room. He took a deep breath and tried to regain his composure. Then he looked at Vanessa with stern eyes. My father pointed to the broken violin and said, "Vanessa, why did you smash Maddie's violin?" Vanessa stammered back, "Look at my face, Dad. I was beaten like this, and you're still asking about the violin?" Dad replied firmly, "I'm asking you first. Please respond to me. Why did you do that?" Vanessa remained silent. She couldn't respond. Dad turned to Claire, his eyes stern. He told my wife, "Claire, I understand your anger because your daughter was mistreated, but hitting people is wrong. You have no right to use violence, regardless of what Vanessa did." Claire replied calmly, "I know." After my wife's response, Dad sighed, turned to Vanessa and said, "Vanessa, you must apologize to Maddie and compensate her for the violin. That violin was Maddie's property. You had absolutely no right to destroy it." Mom immediately jumped up, her voice cold, and asked, "Dad, what are you saying? Your daughter was beaten like this, and you are making her apologize?" After Mom's question, Dad turned to her and said firmly, "Be quiet. Vanessa was wrong first. She smashed a 9-year-old's violin. Don't you notice Maddie crying over there?" Mom looked at Dad angrily and said, "You always side with Ethan. Your daughter's face was beaten up and you're still making her apologize. Are you actually her father?" What Mom said made my father even angrier. Dad slammed his hand onto the table, his voice booming. "Who am I siding with? I am trying to be fair. Vanessa's decision to smash the violin was wrong. Claire's act of hitting someone was also wrong. Both must take responsibility." Everyone in the room agreed with Dad's words. Tyler now said loudly, "That's correct. That's fair." A few seconds later, my father turned to Vanessa and told her, "You apologize to Maddie and pay her $18,000 for the violin right now." Vanessa screamed, "No, I won't apologize. I will not compensate. Why is it always about Maddie? Why does she always receive praise? Haley is also your granddaughter, but do you care about her?" Vanessa's question ended in silence. Dad looked at Vanessa disappointed and asked directly, "So it's because of jealousy? You are jealous of a 9-year-old child?" After Dad's question, Mom jumped in with a cold voice. "Enough. Vanessa is not wrong. Haley is constantly compared to Maddie. Every time the family gathers, you only talk about Maddie. Maddie is a good violin player. Maddie does well in her studies. Maddie, this, Maddie, that." What about Haley? Do you ever ask about Haley? Dad and Mom exchanged glances, the atmosphere becoming increasingly tense. A car suddenly came to a stop in front of the door. Then the doorbell rang. Dad went to open the door, and I noticed 2 police officers standing there. I turned to look around the room, trying to figure out who had called the police. Then I caught Tyler's eye. He stood in the corner of the room, phone still in his hand, and nodded to me. Tyler walked over to me and whispered. I called immediately after Vanessa smashed the violin. This was too serious to handle within the family. At that point, I knew Tyler had made the correct decision, no matter how painful it was. Our family required outside assistance. After my father opened the door, 2 police officers walked in and quickly assessed the situation. The male officer noticed Vanessa's bruised face, the broken violin pieces on the floor, and Maddie crying in my arms. The male officer spoke in a professional manner. We got a report of an incident here. Could anyone tell me what happened? My father stepped forward, trying to remain calm, and said, I am the homeowner. It's a little complicated, officer. Vanessa rushed in front of the cops, pointed at Claire and yelled, She hit me. Look at my face. I want to report an assault. The female officer approached Vanessa and examined her facial injuries. Then she turned to face Claire with serious eyes. Claire stepped forward, her voice calm as she replied, Yes, I hit her. But first, she grabbed my daughter's violin and smashed it. My daughter is only 9 years old. The male officer immediately looked down at the pile of broken violin pieces on the floor before turning to Maddie, who was crying. He took out his notepad and said, Okay, we need statements from everyone. Please remain calm and cooperative. The statement-taking process took nearly an hour. The female officer spoke privately with Maddie, gently inquiring about what had occurred. The male officer obtained statements from me, Claire, Vanessa, and the others. Tyler was also interviewed as a witness. He described everything in detail and honestly. I sat in the corner of the living room holding Maddie, while the police took statements from the others. My mind was racing with the images of what had just occurred. But then old memories came flooding back like a torrent. Vanessa and I's relationship was never peaceful. Since we were children, we lived in 2 different worlds under one roof. Vanessa was Mom's favorite daughter, and I was closer to Dad. I remember when I was 13, I won first place in my school's art contest. Dad was ecstatic, as if he had won the lottery. He brags to all the relatives and hangs my painting in the center of the living room. Mom was different. She looked at the painting indifferently before making a cold comment. What use is drawing? Why don't you focus on proper studying? Vanessa was standing next to Mom, then laughing mockingly and saying sarcastically, That's right. How can drawing help anyone? Just keep dreaming. I stood there, feeling as if someone had dumped a bucket of cold water on my face. Dad wanted to defend me, but Mom had already turned and walked away, dragging Vanessa behind her. That divide widened over time. Mom always gave Vanessa her undivided attention, from studies to work, marriage, and relationships. And I, in her eyes, was always the impractical child with pointless interests. Dad was the opposite. He supported all of my decisions, from studying engineering instead of business, as Mom had preferred, to marrying Claire. He frequently said, You live your own life, Ethan. Don't let anyone make a decision for you. But that favoritism caused an irreversible crack. Vanessa always thought Dad loved me more, whereas I believed Mom never acknowledged me. And now, history was repeating itself with the next generation. Dad adored Maddie, but Haley was abandoned in the shadows. I realized it, but it was too late. In that moment, I wondered if I had any responsibility for this tragedy. Had I unknowingly contributed to the comparison by constantly bragging about Maddie without considering Haley's feelings? The response was painful because I realized that, even though it wasn't intentional, I had contributed to my little niece's wounds. An hour later, after gathering all of the information, the male officer stood in the center of the room and announced, Based on the statements and evidence, we will file reports on 2 incidents. Mrs. Vanessa Harper is charged with intentionally destroying property, specifically a violin worth $18,000 that belonged to Madison Caldwell. Second, Mrs. Claire Caldwell is charged with assault resulting in bodily harm to Mrs. Vanessa Harper. Vanessa screamed, What are you charging me with? I'm the victim here. The male officer looked at her with serious eyes and replied, Ma'am, destroying another person's property, especially a child's property, is a crime. Both parties will have to accept legal responsibility. Mom took a step beside Vanessa, her voice cold as she spoke to the police. "We will hire an attorney. You'll have to pay." Dad shook his head, tired and disappointed. He didn't say anything, just turned and entered the kitchen. That Christmas night, the police filed reports and scheduled both parties to come to the station to complete the necessary procedures. We left my parents' house quietly, Maddie sleeping exhausted in my arms. Claire drove home, and I sat in the back with my daughter. My wife did not say anything, but I could see her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I knew nothing would be the same after that night. The days following Christmas night were the darkest for my family. Maddie sank into depression. She refused to speak, eat, or leave her bed for the entire day. When I asked Maddie if she wanted anything, she simply shook her head and turned to face the wall. After extensive discussions with my wife, I took my daughter to see a child psychologist. Maddie remained silent during her first therapy session. She sat there motionless, staring into space. By the third session, she had burst into tears. The doctor informed me that Maddie had said, through tears, "I don't want to play violin anymore. I'm afraid people will hate me. I'm afraid Mom and Dad got in trouble because of me." Hearing those words made my heart feel like it was being squeezed. My daughter, an innocent 9-year-old, was blaming herself for the adults' actions. Claire has also changed. She grew quieter, frequently sitting alone in the dark. I knew my wife was carrying a burden of guilt, even though she never admitted it. One night, while Maddie was sleeping, I sat down next to Claire and asked, "Are you okay?" Claire remained silent for a long time. Then she turned to face me, her eyes red, and said, "I do not regret hitting her, Ethan. If anyone dares to touch our daughter, I will do it again. But I am scared. I'm afraid Maddie will think her mother is violent." Hearing my wife's words, I took her hand, unsure what to say, as I had similar concerns. 4 months later, the trial was held at Seattle Criminal Court. That day, I sat in the back row with Claire next to me. Maddie wasn't there because I didn't want her to confront those who had hurt her. Vanessa sat on the opposite side with her lawyer. Mom sat right behind her, her face as cold as usual. Dad didn't come because he didn't want to see his family go to court. The trial followed proper procedure. All evidence was thoroughly presented, including images of the shattered violin, the receipt for the $18,000 violin, witness testimony, and medical reports on Vanessa's injuries. When asked to explain her actions, Vanessa stood up with a tense expression. Her lawyer attempted to argue that it was a temporary reaction to long-term psychological pressure. But then the prosecutor asked directly, "Ms. Vanessa, could you please explain why you behaved in that manner toward a 9-year-old child's violin?" Vanessa remained silent for a moment following that question. Then she burst into tears, crying while speaking. "I couldn't take it anymore. Every time the family got together, they only talked about Maddie. Maddie is so good at this. Maddie is extremely talented at it. How about my daughter, Haley tries. Haley also studies hard. But no one looks at my daughter. My father only cares about Maddie." I've had to hear those comparisons for years. Her words elicited a heavy silence throughout the courtroom. A few seconds later, she turned to face me with hateful eyes and asked, "Ethan, do you understand how my daughter feels? Every time she visits her grandparents, she cries because she feels inferior. She asks me why Grandpa does not love her as much as he does Maddie. Do you recognize that feeling?" After that question, I sat in silence, unsure how to feel. Part of me understood Vanessa's pain, but another part of me could not forgive her for what she had done to my daughter. The judge issued the verdict after hearing all of the parties' cases. Vanessa was convicted of intentionally destroying property. Sentence: 18 months probation, mandatory anger management classes, and $18,000 for the violin. Claire was convicted of assault resulting in minor injuries. Sentence: a $2,500 fine and mandatory anger management classes. When the judge sounded the gavel to conclude the session, I looked at Claire. My wife sat there with a calm expression, but I could see her shoulders sagging slightly. A moment later, Mom stood up and assisted Vanessa out of the courtroom. When she walked past where I sat, she came to a halt and looked at me with cold eyes. She said nothing, simply turned and walked away. It was the last time I saw Mom. A week after the trial, I was sitting in the living room when the doorbell rang. When I opened it, I saw Dad standing there, his face more gaunt and tired than the last time I saw him. Dad looked at me with red eyes and asked softly, "Can I come in?" I nodded and opened the door wide for him to enter. Claire was in the kitchen. She looked out, then quietly retreated to the back room, giving my father and me our own space. Dad sat down on the sofa, hands clasped together and head hung low. He remained silent for a long time, as if trying to organize his thoughts. Then he looked up at me, his voice trembling, and said, "Ethan, I came here to apologize." I sat across from him, said nothing and waited. Dad took a deep breath and continued. "I was wrong. I should have intervened earlier. I noticed Vanessa becoming increasingly stressed, and Haley withdrawing more and more, but I did nothing. I kept thinking everything would work out, but it didn't." He paused after that statement, swallowing as if trying to control his emotions, before continuing. "I have to admit that I lacked sensitivity. I adore Maddie. That is true. However, I didn't realize that every time I complimented Maddie, Haley felt excluded. I unknowingly compared my two granddaughters without considering the consequences." Dad looked down at his hands, choking up as he spoke. "Haley is my granddaughter. She deserves to be loved, just like Maddie. But I failed. I wasn't fair to her." I sat there, emotions rising within me. This was the first time I had seen Dad admit his mistake so openly. A moment later, Dad looked up at me and said, "I am not asking you to forgive Vanessa. What she did was unacceptable, but I want you to understand that I am also responsible for this. If I had been more sensitive, if I had intervened sooner, perhaps things would have been different." Hearing Dad's confession, I stood up and walked over to sit beside him. I placed my hand on his shoulder and replied, "I understand, Dad. I do not blame you." Dad turned to look at me. We sat for a long time, saying nothing. Sometimes silence is the most powerful language. It has been nearly 3 years since that fateful Christmas night. Maddie is currently 11 years old. She has overcome the initial traumas. I bought her a new violin, and Maddie resumed playing. She was chosen to join her school's youth orchestra just last week. Claire and I are still together. We went through the most difficult period together, and instead of falling apart, our relationship grew stronger. She finished her anger management classes and experienced significant changes. We learned to communicate more effectively with one another and share our emotions rather than bottle them up inside. Dad still calls me every week. He continues to visit Maddie, and each time he sees her, he tries not to compare or brag too much. I know he's trying to change, and that's enough for me to admire. Mom is still silent. I haven't received a phone call or a text message in nearly 3 years. Dad says she's still angry at me and believes I destroyed the family. I'm not sure if she will ever change, but I've come to accept that fact. Vanessa finished her anger management classes and paid the entire $18,000 in compensation. Dad told me she's changed a lot, is less angry, and is attempting to rebuild her relationship with Haley. I don't know if I'll ever forgive her, but I hope Haley is okay. Something unexpected occurred a few months ago. I got a letter from Haley. She wrote that she does not blame Maddie. She understands that what her mother did was wrong. Haley apologized on her mother's behalf, saying she misses Maddie and the times the two cousins used to play together before everything happened. I read the letter and gave it to Maddie to read. Maddie cried. Since then, Maddie and Haley have begun texting. At first, they only exchanged short messages to check in on each other. The two then gradually increased their conversation and sharing. I didn't stop it because I recognize that both Maddie and Haley are victims of this tragedy. They should not be forced to bear the consequences of the adults' mistakes. After everything we've gone through, I'd like to share with you 6 pieces of advice I gained from my family's tragedy. First, never compare children to one another. Each child has unique value and deserves to be treated fairly. Don't allow one child to live in another's shadow. Second, keep your emotions under control, especially in tense situations. Regardless of how angry you become, violence is never the best solution. Allow the law to intervene. Third, express your emotions rather than allowing them to fester. Vanessa had been harboring resentment for years, and no one knew about it. If she had told Dad about her discrimination early on, if she had shared Haley's pain, perhaps things would have been different. Fourth, don't let children bear adults' guilt. Both Maddie and Haley are victims in this story. Haley blamed herself for believing she wasn't good enough, while Maddie felt guilty for excelling and making others jealous. This is something I would never want to see. Finally, intervene as soon as you notice signs of tension. Dad and I noticed Vanessa becoming more stressed and Haley withdrawing more, but we assumed everything would work out. This was an error. When you notice unusual signs in your family, take the initiative to identify and address the underlying issues. Do not wait until everything explodes. My story ends here. Before I finish the story, I'd like to ask you a question. What would you do if you saw your sister smashing your child's violin? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below the story. And if you were moved by the story, please subscribe to the channel to show your support. Goodbye, and we'll see you again.